Welcome back, everyone, to this year's 34th Annual New York State Foster Care and Adoption Conference. I am Shemin Vizzi. I am back again with more pre-conference interviews for you. So that way you can get a little sneak peek at who we're going to see this year. So over the next couple of weeks, please watch our social media so that way you can see who will be coming. So let's start off with our first interview with Dr. Hollee McGinnis. Let's see what we chatted about. Well, hi, everyone. It is Shemin Vizzi. And as I said before, we are interviewing our workshop presenters, and I'm starting with Dr. Hollee McGinnis. Hollee, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what you do and how it's connected to adoption and foster care community.
Sure. It's so great to be invited. My name is Dr. Hollee McGinnis, but I'm also known as Ihwa Young, and that's my Korean birth name. And I got involved in adoption. I actually never thought I would have a career in it because I was adopted when I was 3.5 from South Korea. And for most of my life, it was just kind of in the background. It's how I got into my family. But in my early 20s in New York City, I ended up starting a group for adult international adoptees to become mentors to the next generation of international adoptees, who at that time was the influx of Chinese adoptees in the 1990s. And that really launched my career. I ended up pursuing a MSW in social work, did policy work at the Donaldson Adoption Institute for 5 years, saw that so much of the policies were being driven by research. And so then I decided to get my PhD in social work. And I'm now an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Virginia Commonwealth University.
So I have your bio that you sent us. So I pulled out some things that I'd love for everyone to hear a little bit more about. When you were mentioning an organization, were you talking about the also known as Incorporated? Why don't you tell us now, you said a snippet of why you why don't you give us a little bit more of why you felt the need to organize that and start it?
Yeah. So I had, I was in my early 20s trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I had some friends stumble upon and invite me to do a leadership training program. It was called Self-Expression Leadership Program. And the program invited us to look at our community and develop a project. And as an undergraduate, I had a lot of questions about my racial ethnic identity. So when I started off as a freshman, I figured I would major in Asian studies because I was having these encounters where people would start to speak to me in Japanese or Chinese, and I didn't know what they were referring to because I really grew up and identified as an Irish Catholic Hollee McGinnis. So I thought, all right, well, I better start learning about Asia because people assume I know everything about Asia. But then my sophomore year, I realized that, yes, I am racially Asian and and I'm from Korea, but I wanted to understand how I was an American with an Irish last name, blonde hair mom, and my Asian face. And so I changed to American Studies and really focused on 20th century American race relations. And that's how I found out that there was such a huge community of just international adoptees from South Korea, over 200,000 of us. And when I had this opportunity to think about developing a program, I thought again of what would have been helpful for me growing up and could I provide that for other people? And the idea of a mentorship program and being able to be connected to other people who had complicated families that look like my family, I thought could be a real benefit. And I think what's been exciting over the past 27 years that the organization is still around is meeting adoptees who had connections when they were younger. So I'm of the generation where culture camps were just developing, or organizations that were run by adoptive parents, but there weren't that many in the 70s and the 80s. And so then to meet this whole nother generation, many of them who are connected, and then our mentees becoming mentors, becoming board members of also known as, really speaks to the power of, I think, adoptee connections. And so that was really how also known as got born. And what I was really clear on was that my conflict in my identity that I felt was because I felt I had to choose one over another, that I had to somehow try to fit my racialized body into a white Irish Catholic framework or frame my faith within the culture and history of Korea. And the truth was, I was both of them and I was neither of them. And so we came upon the name also known as because I wanted to create a space where adoptees could embrace all of their identities and explore all of them. And so that's why I really like to introduce myself as Hollee McGinnis, but also known as Ihwa Young, so I can claim all of those multiple identities and invent new ones. And that to me is the empowering side of being an adoptee, because there's a lot of loss inside of all of that too.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing all that. I appreciate it. One of the things that I saw with your many, many years of experience, I see you play a major role in doing these studies on adoption and surveys. You also are a primary investigator on a national study. I think you're still doing this survey that I think it's still open. Why don't you explain a little bit? So tell me a little bit about what are you looking for? What is this survey about and why? How did it come about? Like everything.
Yeah. So I'm so excited to talk more about this project at the conference. So the project is called Mapping the Life Course of Adoption. And what I'm trying to do is understand what adoption looks like later on in life, because most of the research on adoption, on adoptees specifically, stops by the end of our 20s, as though we don't have the rest of our lives going on. And it's in direct contrast to adoption practitioners, adoptive parents, and certainly adoptees who know that adoption is lifelong, but we haven't mapped it out. So we know a lot about how adoption impacts young people in childhood and adolescence, and a little bit in emerging young adulthood, but not when you're 50, not when you're 60. And when I was at the Donaldson Adoption Institute, I led a study that ended up being framed Beyond Culture Camp. And it was a national study of adopted adults looking at adoptive identity and racial ethnic identity. And we asked a really simple question. We asked the adoptee participants to look at different times in their life and tell us when, how important their adoptive identity was and how important their racial ethnic identity was. And what was really curious was that adoptive identity continued to be important to the majority of people as they continue to get older. So not surprisingly, by middle school, half of the people said their adoptive identity became important to them. But by 30, 40, 50, 80%, 90% of people were still saying their adoptive identity was important to them. So I remember us looking at that and saying, what's going on? It's not like the importance of one's adoption doesn't go away. You know, you'd think maybe there's a resolution, but it didn't. And so those were some of the indicators that I said, we need to understand how adoption's impacting people later on in their lives. In January of 2020, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And in that same 5 years window, about 4 other of my Korean adoptee friends were also diagnosed with breast cancer in our 40s. And so that was another piece that we know from all the research on adverse childhood experiences, that those who have more adverse childhood experiences are at greater risk for physical health problems and challenges. But again, when I looked at the research literature, no one had tracked that for adoptees. So the Mapping the Life Course of Adoption is really seeking to understand how adoptees are aging, what are our physical ailments based on our trauma histories or adverse experiences post-adoption and in adulthood, what is our mental health? And then the other piece is really about how do our connections with other adopted people maybe improve some of those outcomes and affect us.
Oh, you were very good at answering that one. I didn't have to ask the next 17 more. This is I'm very drawn to certain workshops that I don't know very much about, and I find that that new topics come every year for me, and I've done this for quite some time, and this is an amazing topic. I want everybody to what else would you like to to share with anyone that I may not have asked? Do you want to share anything about the why does everybody want to come and see you? Why is this so important to come see Dr. Hollee McGinnis share this information?
Yeah. So I'm really looking, so you had asked before, the survey is still live. We'll be
Yes.
closing it around the end of April, but I'm gonna keep a special link just for members who come to the conference so that if there's an adopted adult 18 and older, you can be adopted from internationally, domestically, or from foster care. You just have to be an adopted person in the US. That's the only limiter, and 18 and over. So you have to be technically adult. And what I want people to come is that this is a project that's far bigger than just one survey. I have really been thinking as an adopted person who's also a scholar and um, realizing that many adoptees now are becoming the scholars in adoption, thinking about how we do our research so that it's much more accessible to people in the community. So I've designed the study to be community embedded and engaged. And what that means is that I am really keen to translate the findings with the community of adopted adults. And I think that is a paradigm shift because traditional research typically dives into a community, extracts information, writes up complicated papers in academic journals that no one can access. And then the community doesn't know what was learned about their experiences. So I'm really excited because I will share during my workshop some of very, very preliminary descriptive things that we're finding, but really to talk more about how can we begin to generate knowledge by and for and with adoptees rather than extracting out that data and really making it accessible so that wherever and at whatever age an adopted person is, they can at least have access to information that can help them to make sense of what their lived experience is.